Hello, everyone, and welcome to an exciting interview with Aaron Roth, who is a principal at the Chertoff Group. Homeland Security today has been recognizing the 20th anniversary of the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And we've been talking to plank holders and other experts who have been working on the DHS mission for many, many years. Today, we're excited to talk with Aaron Roth. He is a member of the Chertoff Group, who's a strategic advisory firm to the Government Technology and Services Coalition, and have been instrumental in working with Homeland Security today to look at a lot of the challenges before Homeland Security and provide true expert commentary. So Aaron was the Deputy Executive Assistant Administrator for Operations Support at the Transportation Security Administration. And, with, my background with friends with the Coast Guard, he was also a captain in the U.S. Coast Guard, retired after 24 years of service. And in his last assignment, he acted as the Coast Guard Commandant's strategic advisor, where he specialized in emerging strategies and policy issues. So Aaron is incredibly experienced with the Homeland mission. He's been around it at a strategic level for a very long time. And so we wanted to talk a little bit today about the President's Homeland Security budget, and perhaps a little bit about the recently released QHSR. So Aaron, welcome.
Thank you, Christina. I'm glad to be with you, and I appreciate the time today. Look forward to the discussion.
Excellent. Well, you certainly have the experience and expertise to talk a little bit about, not necessarily DHS at their 20th anniversary, but certainly their strategic positioning right now. Recently, it's May 31st, and we've seen in the last couple of weeks a lot of strategies come out of the White House, strategies for AI, strategies for cyber. The QHSR was released. Can you talk a little bit about the President's budget to support these things and your view of what's happening, since it's the first time we've really kind of seen a little decrease?
That's right. Thank you, Christina. Absolutely. And, when we find ourselves sort of in the threat context that we are today, the world is complicated and complex. And, no one could have predicted 20 years ago when the department was established, all the things that the Department of Homeland Security could have been involved with today. I mean, we find ourselves on the heels of, a major pandemic. We've got sort of nation state competition at the moment. We've got huge cybersecurity challenges, and we still have, challenges on the terrorism front. And many of that, is now, sort of been a conversation around domestic terrorism as well. So the department certainly has its hands full. And when you look at, where they were this year in the President's budget, the one of two departments that actually had a decrement, a 1% decrement for Homeland Security. And, when I saw that, I was sort of shocked, being a fan and advocate, and certainly someone who really cares about the department and the mission that it has, that struck me as, being, notable in terms of, how the department is viewed across the national security enterprise. And I think part of that is, still sort of this old idea that people have about the department being solely focused on international terrorism, sort of the roots of its beginning some 20 plus years ago now, instead of sort of seeing a more modern day Homeland Security enterprise that really is integrated with the national security strategy and the defense strategy and everything else that's been articulated for the country over the past 9+ months now. And I think the department certainly has a role there, and being a huge advocate, I think it could do a little better job of communicating that vision and strategy. I know the QHSR does that in some regard, but maybe doesn't go far enough in connecting it to sort of more modern day strategy of the U.S. government and sort of how to approach that going forward. So I think we see a reflection of that in the decrement associated with the budget.
So we are seeing a lot of mission areas being addressed by the administration, particularly in cyber and AI and some of the emerging technologies. GTSC just hosted the FitGov Summit last week to talk about governing technology before it governs us. So how do you see that move towards tech affecting the budget? It seems like a very expensive endeavor to keep up with AI and everything else. Do you think CISA is funded enough? Do you think that the Office of the Cyber Director is funded enough? Are we putting enough resources towards that emerging technology sector?
Yeah, that's a great question, Christina. And I think, a little bit of context is important here. When you look at CISA alone, as sort of a reflection of the department more writ large in terms of its evolution and maturation, you think CISA, 10 plus years ago was in PPD, and we didn't even really imagine cybersecurity having such a significant role that it does today. Now, today, here we are. The president has certainly committed a lot of resources. CISA has been a part of that relative, obviously, to cybersecurity. But I still think there's some issues within the department that still need to be sort of worked out in terms of, who has oversight and regulatory responsibility for industry and working alongside CISA. And I know a lot of those conversations are ongoing, but it sort of reflects the larger challenge from the department from the beginning, right? The point was to establish the department with a sort of a light headquarters element, where sort of the components were meant to be empowered. And you've seen that sort of carry through over the past 20 plus years with the department. And then you see an organization like CISA get established in sort of a, I don't want to call it a new domain, but an emerging domain of threat and vulnerability for the country. And so how we operationalize CISA is still an outstanding question. So I would say there's a lot of resources going to it. I think a lot still has to be decided on, how organizations like the Coast Guard, like TSA, like CBP, and others are going to interact with CISA in order to operationalize cybersecurity. But you can tell, certainly I'm dated, having left 3 years ago from TSA, but the progress to date has been rather dramatic. You've seen TSA issue regulatory, requirements. You've seen the Coast Guard do so. I think you'll continue to see that climb. The challenge will be is can we meet the threat before the threat persists and creates more of a problem for us by the time we sort of negotiate some of these things. So I think on that front, there's still some work to do, but I know that they're working hard at it as well.
Absolutely. That's always the challenge, isn't it? Staying ahead of the threat. And it is good to see that the executive orders, the strategies that are being released are taking a long-term consideration of cyber and how everything interacts, because with all the warnings from the tech folks about taking a pause on AI, how AI will impact everything, it can also impact things positively. And so if we put our resources in the right place and have the right conversations, we hope to do that. So the administration also released the first QHSR, the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, in a while. And what were your thoughts on that piece? That was meant to kind of give an overview of the priorities and how they're doing, and was a great idea in concept. But it is another report. DC's full of reports. So how do you see this QHSR from the Biden administration?
Yeah, Christina, I think, the QHSR is obviously legislatively mandated to be done. I think it may be an idea that's a little past its time. There was a QDR back in the day, and the Defense Department sort of moved on from that and sort of now releases a larger strategy document that ties directly to the national security strategy, which I think, sort of strikes me as appropriate for today's environment, especially, given the timely, nature of threats and how they evolve, that you can have strategies that sort of quickly turn and face the threat wherever it may be for the country. I think the QHSR is sort of more of a, for lack of a better term, a deliberate, 4-year look to see how the department is performing across sort of its original goals and intent. I know it's been a while since we had our last QHSR, so this one maybe has a little bit more meaning in that regard. The problem that I sort of look through the lens of the QHSR and see is that how does it directly connect to the national security strategy and the Defense Department strategy? In ways that sort of, provide a holistic view of how Homeland Security nests to both the Defense Department and obviously the White House. And I think the QHSR articulates the missions of Homeland Security well, but I'm not sure I necessarily see that connective tissue relative to some of the more, immediate strategies that we've seen regarding national security. And, there were some new changes in the QHSR. They did add a mission in there, around exploitation, and certainly, that seems appropriate. But we see much of the traditional missions of the components addressed throughout the QHSR. And not that that's a bad thing by any means, but I don't know that it sort of communicates grand strategy in a way that might help the department over time. And I want to be clear that there's not going to be any strategy in my mind that, necessarily is a panacea for the department and all of a sudden, the money starts flowing from heaven because of it. But I do think the department can do a little more around how to create strategy in ways that create strategic priorities that nest under, White House and U.S. government strategy in a way that attaches the department to have meaningful purpose towards those goals of the country. And that's something that I think is a little bit lacking in the QHSR, but it's not surprising. The document is a legislative mandate. It hasn't been done for a while. So, kudos to the department for getting it, completed. And I think, maybe there's some future opportunity to think about how the department more closely aligns with national strategy. The other point I would make here, Christina, is I think, a lot of what the department gets blamed for, we saw some articles last fall about, 20 years of failure in the department, which I think is entirely inaccurate. But all that being said, I'm not sure that, there's total responsibility around how the department was stood up and sort of where it is today. And, the analogy I use, we were sort of talking beforehand, is it's as if the department was built on a foundation that's half sand, half concrete, right? And everybody wants to blame those who are leading the department and the agencies and everything that they do for the part that was built on sand. And the reality is, we need to pour some more cement under the department. We need to minimize legislative oversight of the department. We need to find creative ways of empowering the department. It doesn't necessarily take away responsibility from components or autonomy and sort of the responsibility of each one of the component heads, but empowers, the jointness of the department over time. And there have been some efforts by Jay Johnson and others to try to make the department perform a little more jointly, have a little more, a cross-cutting approach to requirements and acquisition and other things. But I think some more can be done. But, let's not forget that the way it was established is part of the reason why there are challenges. And until we clean up some of that, I think the department leadership is going to continue struggling with many of the things that they have. And I'm not one to suggest the department by any means has been a failure, because I just don't believe that's been true. However, I do think there are some things that need to be revisited. And it would seem appropriate at 20 years and sort of looking ahead at our national security and how the government is organized around security, that you could take a look at some of the foundational issues regarding the department.
Well, I love that you say that. We have been talking to the plank holders, and certainly I just think that perhaps the department doesn't do the best job communicating with the public about all of their accomplishments. And of course, they're kind of written off when they put out their press release about the latest thing. But the truth is they have done an extraordinary job. You were at TSA. I mean, I think air travel has to be the safest it's been ever, given it was such a target for terrorism. And across the department, the Coast Guard, the adaptation to creating CISA out of NPPD, all of that has been kind of a churn to meet the threat of what's happening today. So, I agree with you. And the sad part is so many have been saying the same things for 20 years, fix the appropriations. Do not hang everybody out every single year on the appropriations. Do not have so many oversight committees that, instead of doing their jobs, people are on the Hill testifying all the time. We've heard this for 20 years. And yet it's not fixed. So you are spot on when you say that the department needs more concrete and less sand. And yeah, it's been, same message every year, and it's not fixed.
Right.
It's
Christina, I think, I was going to say, to your point, to pull the thread even further, the lack of an off bill, right? I mean, I remember like the life's work of Jay Johnson during his tenure was trying to get an off bill across the goal line. And if you had more of a dependable authorization process for the department, then you'd have more clarity. We get a little more crisp about the intent. And, again, I don't want to overstate the reality of these things. The department is in a tough business. It's a thankless job. It will always be a thankless job. And it also is in a position where many of its mission sets are the best thing you can say is nothing bad happened. So the reality is marketing is hard from that perspective. It's difficult to connect to the American public when that's your narrative. It's like, hey, TSA did a great job this year. Everyone was safe. Of course, people expect that. So it is difficult to communicate some of these themes. They could certainly help themselves a little bit, I think, in that regard. I think an off bill would certainly be favorable in terms of providing some better intent, if you will, for the department. And lastly, the sort of, challenge of the mission of immigration, right? It continues to be a topic that just sort of throws DHS, right and left, politically, and it becomes a very challenging dynamic for the administration inside of Homeland Security to manage. And I don't care if that's Republican or if it's Democrat, it's still a challenge. The problem of managing the border is a mission that the department knows how to do well. The challenge becomes the atmospherics around it in terms of how the department is sort of characterized publicly. So it will always be challenged with some of these missions, but I think there are a few things that can be done to help it move forward more progressively, if you will.
So in that decrease, where was the decrease or that you saw, and where do you think the budget should be? If we do have the border mission, we do have the cyber mission all in DHS's purview. So where should that money be going, and how much more should they get?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's always easy to say that, an agency or a department should get more money. And that's not the world we live in. And certainly, when you look at the broader strategic, view, our debt continues to escalate. I mean, we've had conversations over the weekend about the debt ceiling, right, between the president and the speaker. And we're going to continue to see how that plays out over the course of today and the next couple of days. But, the whole overtone of where we are in terms of our spending is significant. So, in terms of the department, the challenge for me is, any typical year, and I would not call the past 18 months typical when you look at inflation and sort of the broader macroeconomic environment, but any normal year, 3% growth in your budget really just keeps current services going. So if you're the department to do what you did last year, you basically need at least 3% or so to make sure you can maintain what you did last year. Anything under that is a decrement in most instances. So in this case, when you look at where the department was, 1% under, and then you look at inflation being at historic highs of 8+%, you're really talking about nearly a 10% reduction in actual buying power for the department. And so then you look at the priorities that money is being spent for the department. Much of it is going to cybersecurity. We did see some, positive increases in personnel. The department is a very manpower intensive organization, 220,000 strong, right? So when you look at these operational components, TSA is very manpower intensive. Secret Service, very manpower intensive. Coast Guard, very capital and manpower intensive, right? And so, people cost money. And so there were some increases, but I think when you look across the board, the pain was absorbed in other, places around the department, which typically means support services, things that aren't, necessarily the bells and whistles that people like to fund. That's where the squeezes have to occur. And in many instances, each one of the agencies is left to its own devices. And, again, the macroeconomic context, each department and agency has to absorb more of its mandatory cost year over year. And usually that's people, and that leaves less and less and less to actually decrement. And it ends up being operations in some way, shape, or form, typically.
So you make a very good point. I don't know if many understand that the DHS budget does go primarily for salaries. CBP is the largest law enforcement unit in the United States. That is all salaries. Coast Guard, like you said, is all salaries. How do you see the movement toward pay equity affecting that budget, and how will it affect TSA? Have you taken a look at that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an administrative priority for some time now to get the workforce paid. And, I'll tell you, when I retired from the Coast Guard and I went over to TSA, I didn't have any appreciation at all for sort of all the people you saw at the checkpoints, right? Some 45,000 plus of them, and sort of the mission that they have to do, in addition to the overseas mission that TSA is responsible for, that I think often gets overlooked because we think only of our domestic airports. But we don't think about, really in some instances where the threat typically manifests itself overseas, and the TSA's got a huge responsibility there, along with CBP and the intel community and others that TSA works very closely with. But on the domestic front, when you look at this is the analogy I use here is the same argument we have when you look at our military and you see the youngest enlisted, staff that we have in the military. Many moons ago, many of them qualified for food stamps, right? And so you always end up in this conversation that sort of people galvanize around is like, hey, we need to pay our troops a little bit more so they can have families and not be on food stamps and all the other things. Well, that same sort of argument applied to when we looked at our TSA workforce. It wasn't a traditional sort of scheduled workforce like you find in other places. So it's been a priority of the administrator to get them into more of a stabilized and better pay system, if you will, to try to be, more of a retention and attractive tool, and also just to frankly pay them for the good work that they do. So certainly that's going to cost money. But it's the right thing to do when you consider that, they're volunteers, they come to government, they have an important job. I mean, one mistake, from a TSO could be incredibly costly, and you're paying them almost nothing for what they do, right? So I think that's the impetus behind it all. And without a doubt, it's going to cost more money. But hopefully over time, as we get better with our technology at the checkpoint, maybe there are some efficiencies that can be gained over time with personnel. So you get, not only a better paid, but a higher trained force over time. And I think that's really the glide slope they're on over a period of time as they bring in new technology.
Absolutely. Great points. So do you have any closing comments on the budget or the QHSR? It's been amazing talking with you. I could probably talk to you all day. I don't know if everyone would listen all day, but any closing comments?
Yeah, well, one, again, thank you, Christine. I appreciate your time. It's really great, all the hard work you do supporting the department and supporting the entire community of interest around Homeland Security. And, it has sort of felt like, just looking from the outside in, now being after 30 years in the department, sort of being in a role where I can see a lot of different businesses, a lot of different technologies, and, then looking at the department and just sort of see, a little bit of the black eye they've taken over the past few years. And I think that's in part because, people are like, okay, we're done with the war on terrorism, so now Homeland Security is less important. And I guess, point number one for me would be, I couldn't be farther from the truth. The department's missions are critical to what we do. And it sounds cliche, but they absolutely are. I mean, if TSA stopped doing its job today, we would all know. If CBP stopped doing its job today, we would all know. I mean, there's many, analogies here to how the department serves in the role of firehouse, police department, regulator, as a federal government entity for our nation's security, much more so than anyone else. And so, we can sort of poke at the department and, push them on political issues that we don't like. But at the end of the day, there's 220,000 plus, workforce there that is really doing a lot to protect Americans day in, day out, whether you know it or not. And oftentimes the only way we know it is when we walk through a checkpoint in an airport, but we don't think about the maritime. We don't think about the approaches and border unless we see it on television. So it is a thankless job, and it's critically important. The last thing I would say on sort of the budget side is, I would like to see Congress own this a little bit more. And I would like to see them take a little bit more of a heavy hand in trying to help bolster the department. And I think the department could help itself a little bit by providing a little more clarity on its strategy and its priorities in a way in which they can be easily communicated, that they can go to the Hill with, that the Hill could then grab a hold of and support. And I do think part of that, and again, it's been said 1,000 times, like you mentioned, is how do we create better oversight, more streamlined oversight, and get to a point where the department is managed like DOJ, like DOD, and like the intelligence community and others, where they really have a community of interest on the Hill that they can really work closely with to move forward in important ways for the country.
That's an awesome way. Less politics, more substance. That's an awesome way to wrap this up. You know, as we've talked to the plank holders, it is not more clear how much the department has done for America. How, whether it's been bumpy or not, it was the right thing to do, that the threats are now very, very intertwined. You can't really touch one thing without touching other things. And that's what I think has been so clear to me. Homeland security is everything. It's human trafficking, it's cyber, it's border, it's flying safely, it's just everything. So I can't thank you enough for what you've done for the country, your service in the Coast Guard. Thank you for that. Thank you for continuing to bring your wisdom to the Homeland Mission. And we love working with the Chertoff Group and all of you. So thank you for your time today. And anytime you want to talk to us, just reach out and let us know. Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, Christina. Have a good day.
You too.